I observed that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the institutional foundation of Western security architecture for 75 years, is experiencing not a temporary policy disagreement, but a structural crisis that exposes the unsustainability of European defense dependency on American commitment that was always conditional, but is now explicitly transactional. The second Trump administration's demand that European members increase defense spending to 3% of GDP or face reduced American security guarantees reveals what was previously obscured, that the transatlantic alliance rested on American willingness to subsidize European defense, that this willingness is eroding as domestic political and fiscal pressures mount, and that European states lack both the military capacity and the political will to provide their own security without American backing. I trace this not as Trump-specific disruption, but as acceleration of trends visible for decades. Declining European defense capabilities relative to emerging threats, growing American frustration with burden-sharing imbalances, and the fundamental mismatch between European social welfare priorities and the defense spending levels required for strategic autonomy. What I document is the collision between institutional inertia, NATO structures built on assumptions of permanent American engagement, and geopolitical reality where American strategic focus shifts toward Indo-Pacific competition with China, where European defense industries have atrophied through post-Cold War peace dividend spending cuts, and where the political economy of European states makes the military investments necessary for autonomy incompatible with maintaining social contracts that populations will defend at the ballot box. I begin with the spending arithmetic because it reveals the scale of the gap between rhetoric and capacity. European NATO members collectively spend approximately 1.7% of GDP on defense as of 2025, with significant variation. Poland and the Baltic states exceed 2.5% given proximity to Russia, while Germany, Italy, and Spain remain below 1.5%. The United States spends approximately 3.5% of GDP on defense, and even this understates the gap because American GDP is larger, meaning the absolute spending difference is vast. The Trump administration's demand for 3% European spending is framed as fairness. Why should American taxpayers fund European defense when Europeans prioritize social spending over their own security? But the demand's real function is to create political crisis that forces European recognition of dependency. I analyze why reaching 3% is not merely difficult but potentially impossible within European political economy constraints without triggering social and political upheaval. For Germany to reach 3% would require approximately doubling defense spending from current levels, adding roughly 70 billion euros annually to military budgets. This spending increase would need to come from either tax increases, which are politically toxic in a population already facing high tax burdens, or from cuts to social programs, healthcare, pensions, education, unemployment insurance that form the core of the social contract and that populations fiercely defend. The German political system, still shaped by post-World War II anti-militarist culture and Green Party influence, cannot easily legitimize military spending increases that come at the cost of social welfare, creating the paradox that the spending necessary for security undermines the domestic stability that security is meant to protect. I examine the capability gap that spending levels reflect. European militaries, after 3 decades of post-Cold War reductions, lack the ammunition stockpiles, logistics infrastructure, air defense systems, and force readiness to conduct sustained conventional warfare without American support. The Ukraine conflict revealed this starkly. European states donated artillery ammunition to Ukraine and within months had depleted their own stockpiles to levels where they could not sustain operations for more than days or weeks. European defense production capacity has atrophied. Factories were closed, supply chains dismantled, and manufacturing shifted to civilian purposes or offshored. Rebuilding this capacity requires not just funding, but time measured in years or decades to reconstruct industrial base, train workforce, and develop supply chains, time that may not exist if Russian threat materializes. I trace the nuclear deterrence question that underlies all conventional force discussions. European security ultimately rests on the assumption that American nuclear weapons would be used to defend Europe if Russia attacked, an assumption encoded in NATO Article 5 collective defense commitment. But this assumption depends on American willingness to risk nuclear exchange over European territory, and the credibility of this commitment has always been questionable. Would the United States accept destruction of American cities to defend Warsaw or Tallinn? France maintains an independent nuclear deterrent, but it is sized for French defense, not continental protection, and French doctrine has never clearly committed to extending nuclear umbrella to other European states. The result is that European defense, stripped to essentials, depends on American nuclear guarantee that is becoming explicitly conditional and that may not hold under crisis conditions. I analyze the political impossibility facing European leaders. Their publics demand both security and social spending, but the fiscal reality is that achieving one requires sacrificing the other. Politicians who campaign on military spending increases face electoral punishment from voters who prioritize health care and pensions. Politicians who maintain social spending face criticism that they are free riding on American protection and leaving their nations vulnerable. The political system produces paralysis, incremental defense spending increases that are too small to achieve capability, but large enough to strain budgets, combined with rhetorical commitment to strategic autonomy that lacks credible implementation pathway. The EU's defense industrial strategy, announced repeatedly since 2016, has produced minimal integrated capacity because member states protect national defense industries, refuse procurement coordination, and maintain separate supply chains that prevent economies of scale. I examine the Russia dimension that makes this crisis urgent rather than theoretical. Russia, having sustained military operations in Ukraine for 3 years despite Western sanctions and weapons supplies to Kiev, has demonstrated that it can wage attritional warfare longer than European political systems can maintain support for Ukraine. If Ukraine collapses or accepts territorial concessions, Russia emerges with validated military capacity, tested weapons systems, and war-hardened forces positioned near NATO borders. The Baltic states, Poland and Romania, face direct threat. Their security depends on NATO commitment that is now uncertain. Putin has systematically tested NATO resolve, cyber attacks, hybrid warfare, energy coercion, disinformation, and observed that responses are divided, delayed, and limited by member states' competing interests and domestic political constraints. I trace how Trump's transactionalism accelerates dynamics that were already eroding alliance cohesion. His explicit statements that NATO is obsolete, that America will not automatically defend members who do not meet spending targets, and that European security is European responsibility represent not departure from American strategic thought, but vocalization of views long held within American defense establishment, but previously unexpressed in official rhetoric. The permanent national security bureaucracy in Washington has for years viewed European defense dependency as unsustainable given Indo-Pacific priorities, but maintained alliance commitments through institutional inertia and belief in liberal international order. Trump's disruption is not that he introduced skepticism about NATO value, but that he eliminated the diplomatic performance that obscured the skepticism, forcing Europeans to confront what American commitment actually means when stripped of reassuring rhetoric. I analyze the German dilemma as paradigmatic of broader European structural constraints. Germany is Europe's largest economy and industrial power, the state whose leadership and resources are essential for any credible European defense architecture, yet it is also the state most institutionally and culturally resistant to militarization. Decades of Ostpolitik-oriented German security thinking toward engagement with Russia rather than military deterrence. The peace dividend from reunification was invested in social programs rather than defense, and the political culture shaped by Nazi history and Green Movement influence remains deeply skeptical of military solutions. The Nord Stream pipeline dependence on Russian gas was not merely economic calculation, but expression of belief that economic interdependence produces peace. a belief the Ukraine invasion shattered but which still shapes political culture that cannot easily pivot to viewing military force as legitimate policy instrument. I examined the alternative that European strategic autonomy rhetoric implies, a European defense capacity independent of American support, capable of deterring Russia, protecting European interests in adjacent regions, and maintaining credible conventional and nuclear forces. This would require not 3% of GDP, but likely 4 to 5% to build from current depleted state to operational capability, sustained over a decade or more. It would require integrated European defense procurement ending national industrial protection, common European strategic culture replacing national threat perceptions, and political leadership willing to prioritize long-term security over short-term electoral incentives. None of these conditions exist, and the institutional mechanisms that might create them, deeper EU integration, European army proposals, common defense budget, face insurmountable opposition from member states unwilling to cede sovereignty over defense policy. I trace the Eastern European perspective that diverges sharply from Western European calculations. Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, and Czech Republic perceive existential threat from Russia based on historical experience and geographic proximity. These states have increased defense spending, welcomed American troop deployments, and advocated for aggressive NATO posture toward Russia because they calculate that their survival depends on deterrence. They view German and French reluctance to confront Russia as naivete or worse, as willingness to sacrifice Eastern European security for commercial relationships with Moscow. The alliance increasingly splits between Eastern members who want maximum American commitment and forward defense, and Western members who prefer diplomatic engagement and minimal military spending, a split that Russia actively exploits through differential pressure and inducements. I analyzed the scenario that NATO structures were designed to prevent but may now face, a limited Russian military operation against a Baltic state, seizing territory in hours before NATO can respond, then presenting the alliance with choice between accepting fait accompli or initiating Article 5 military response that risks escalation to nuclear threshold. The scenario exposes the commitment uncertainty. Would Germany and France risk war with nuclear-armed Russia over Estonia? Would the United States? NATO deterrence rests on the assumption that the answer is yes, but the credibility of this assumption declines as American commitment becomes conditional and as European capacity remains insufficient to respond without American support. Russia can test this through incremental provocations, cyber attacks, airspace violations, hybrid operations that individually fall below Article 5 threshold, but collectively demonstrate that NATO response is constrained by political divisions and capability limitations. I examined the domestic American political dynamics driving disengagement. The United States faces fiscal deficits exceeding $2 trillion annually, infrastructure investment needs in the trillions, and political polarization that makes every budget allocation contentious. The case for European defense spending becomes politically impossible to justify when American voters see their own bridges collapsing, schools underfunded, and healthcare unaffordable while European states maintain generous social programs funded by American security subsidy. The political coalition that sustained Cold War commitment, bipartisan foreign policy establishment, defense industry interests, and popular anti-Soviet sentiment has fragmented. The defense industry still supports NATO spending, but popular support has eroded as the Soviet threat disappeared and as economic competition with China becomes the defining strategic challenge where European alliance offers limited value. I trace the China factor that reorients American strategic priorities away from European theater. The Indo-Pacific region represents the primary arena of great power competition for the remainder of the century given China's economic scale, military modernization, and territorial ambitions in Taiwan and South China Sea. American military planning increasingly focuses on deterring Chinese action in the Pacific, requiring force posture, weapon systems, and alliance structures optimized for that theater rather than European conventional warfare. European NATO members offer minimal contribution to Indo-Pacific contingencies. They lack power projection capability, have limited regional interests, and face domestic political opposition to involvement in Asian conflicts. From American strategic perspective, resources committed to European defense are resources unavailable for the competition that will determine hegemonic outcomes. I analyze whether the alliance can survive this structural divergence or whether it will hollow into consultative forum without credible collective defense function. The optimistic scenario is that European states achieve gradual capability improvement, American commitment stabilizes under post-Trump administrations, and the alliance adapts to burden-sharing reality while maintaining deterrence. But this scenario requires political will that is not evident, fiscal flexibility that European states do not possess, and time that geopolitical developments may not allow. The pessimistic scenario is that the alliance fragments as American security guarantees become unreliable, as European states pursue separate accommodations with Russia or divergent defense policies, and as the institutional structure persists while its operational function dissolves, a zombie alliance that exists formally but cannot act collectively when tested. I return to the core question: can European security architecture survive transition from American guaranteed order to European self-sufficiency? Or does the transition itself create vulnerability window that adversaries will exploit? The historical precedent is not encouraging. Previous eras of great power transition featured wars as rising and declining powers competed and as security architectures collapsed before replacements could be established. The current transition differs in that nuclear weapons make direct great power war potentially suicidal. But this does not prevent limited conflicts, proxy wars, or coercive actions below nuclear threshold. The risk is not World War III, but rather a series of crises where NATO's inability to respond cohesively and decisively undermines deterrence until an adversary miscalculates that the alliance will not fight, triggering the conflict that the alliance exists to prevent. I conclude with the systemic implications. The Atlantic Alliance fracture reveals that security architectures built on assumptions of permanent hegemonic commitment cannot survive when the hegemon's interests diverge and when dependent states lack capacity to replace the commitment they lose. It demonstrates that social welfare states and military great power status may be incompatible given fiscal constraints and political economy realities, that European populations will defend their social contracts more vigorously than they will support defense spending increases. It shows that international institutions persist through institutional inertia long after the material conditions that created them have changed, producing dangerous gap between formal commitments and actual capabilities. Most fundamentally, it exposes that the post-Cold War peace dividend was consumed rather than banked, that the military-industrial capacity necessary for conventional deterrence was dismantled rather than maintained, and that rebuilding this capacity may not be possible within democratic political systems where electorates punish politicians for prioritizing security over immediate welfare. The alliance is not ending suddenly, but it is hollowing inexorably, and the hollow structure may collapse when tested by adversaries who recognize that Article 5 commitment now means whatever political leaders under domestic pressure decide it means in the moment of crisis.